So when I was growing up, if I'd walked through fields in Suffolk, I would have seen clouds of lapwings flying up. Now, if you might see one or two. And we know what the figures are. Police movies and crime movies set. Nobody lived there. It was a scary place. A lot of drug trafficking went on in there. There's a very big project in Snowdonia, in Erie, where we're taking the pylons out and putting the cable under the estuary in Snowdonia. So huge projects which are transforming those landscapes.
Chris, you're a renowned, internationally well-known broadcaster, author, environmentalist, horticulturalist, landscape architect, and I can tell you now, you have been a real influence on my career, because I did a geography and landscape studies degree in the 80s, and in my first role as a landscape officer for a local authority, I bought a book, The Wild Side of Town, and I was full of fire, storming into the Parks Department with this book under my shoulder padded arm, saying we need to change things, we need to mow less. But Chris, welcome, and perhaps you can tell us about how you as a young person became interested in nature and how that led through your early career.
Well, I was very lucky. I grew up in a family, my mum and dad were both really keen on gardening and keen on the countryside, and I was born in the middle of Sheffield, but we moved out to what then was a village about 3 miles from the middle of Sheffield, so on the edge of the Peak District. In the next, I suppose, 20 years, it got completely consumed by housing estates. It was a big overspill area, but I was lucky to have mum and dad who were really enthusiastic. Their passion was rambling in the Peak District at weekends. My mum was a great gardener. And so, it was just a part of what I did always, really. And my dad was a school teacher, and I always say that he was of the nature table variety. He was teaching kids and getting them out whenever he could, and that, I think, had a big influence on me as well, really. But also, I suspect all of that house building on the green fields and the open spaces that I played in as a kid probably had a great influence on me too. I think that's, as much as anything, what turned me into a campaigner, really. I wasn't thinking about it at the time. I was just missing the patch where I used to pick my blackberries because it had got built on, or missing the pond that I used to catch my newts in because it had got filled in. But with hindsight, I think that was a pretty formative part of my childhood, really. And it led to me really thinking, well, horticulture's the obvious career. I'd been growing plants with my mum to sell at the garden gate for quite a few years, rockery plants. And then I worked on the Parks Department in Sheffield for a year and went off to university to Y College in Kent. And only to discover that I was then going to be spending 3 years being taught how to kill everything, really. This was the 60s. And it was the great chemical and mechanical revolution. That's really when the whole kind of way of managing land changed. So I was taught about crop protection. One of the things that I remember particularly now was that we had mycology lectures about fungi, but they were all about plant diseases. And not a word about how delicious they are or how interesting they are as a kind of understory of forests and woodlands. So it was a very very negative kind of education in a way. But it was at a time of student revolution, the 60s. I was president of the East Kent Students Association in 1968. So I was there in the revolution. And mainly, I spent 3 years running the folk club. So I had a really interesting kind of education, but came out of all of that, I suppose, with a determination to undo some of the stuff that everybody else was learning about. And I've been doing that ever since, really.
Fantastic.
Trying to work with nature rather than against it.
So did you have any other like-minded students around you who were challenging the teaching they were receiving, saying, kill this, control that. And were you noisy in the classroom saying, hang on a minute?
No, I don't think I was really. Not at that time. I was too preoccupied with all of these other social activities, as you are so often with students. And I remember I was also about one of the few people there. It was the agricultural and horticultural faculty for London University at the time. Relatively small. Everybody else was doing agriculture or horticulture. Most of them seemed to have a sports car that they could jump in at weekends and drive off back to their farm. I didn't, needless to say. I'd come down from the north, so that was in itself a bit of a culture shock for them and for me. And I spent a lot of my spare time wandering around the Kent Downs, just enjoying that landscape. And not really thinking at the time that what I was being taught was the wrong kind of stuff. It's only really with hindsight you think, well, good grief, they were still shooting bullfinches in orchards in 1960 odd because they were seen as a pest that ate the flower buds. Now you'd be lucky to find an orchard in that part of Kent. So things have changed dramatically, really. But I think it did certainly teach me about campaigning. The student politics side of things was extremely active then. And so I've always been a campaigner, I suppose, and some of that's related to trees, and some of it's related to other things. But I wouldn't have missed it for the world. I had a wonderful 3 years at Kent, and I'm still, even now, quite involved with the student reunion world of Y College. We had a hog roast in North Yorkshire a few weeks ago, so it was rather strange, as it always is, seeing all these other wrinkly old people that you vaguely can see through the wrinkles were the people that you knew at the age of 20 or 21 or whatever.
All that wisdom and experience. So after university, what happened next?
Well, I got a job. I got a job in the Midlands working for a nursery, just at the point where the landscape industry was being born, really, and the garden centre industry. And I was very lucky. I worked for a firm called Blakedown Nurseries and Blakedown Landscapes. Until the end of the 60s, there really wasn't a landscape contracting industry, and there wasn't a garden centre industry. And it was things like the invention of plastic pots, that actually revolutionised how you bought your plants. And the landscape industry partly grew out of disaster, in a way. The Aberfan disaster in South Wales suddenly spawned a whole new industry of land reclamation, which had never existed before, really. And I was just there at that moment. And when I left university, I went to the States and worked there for 2 or 3 months. And that gave me a real insight into garden design and the way that things were changing there. So I came back into this very vigorous, youngish company at a time when everything was changing. And for the first 3 or 4 years, I suppose, I was the only landscape architect in landscape contracting and the only contractor in the landscape profession. So I was in that really interesting situation. So from the very early stages, I was involved with conferences and running training courses and that kind of thing. And I taught landscape architecture then in parallel with that work for the next 15 years or so. And I was teaching part-time postgraduate students. And that's really where the pressure came from. It was those students who were all members of Friends of the Earth, were all kind of enraged about everything in sight, as you are as a student. And they really got me involved with campaigning for urban green space particularly. And out of that kind of work, I suppose a lot of what I've done subsequently grew. But the main influence, ironically, was the Thatcher government coming in, which sounds so counterintuitive, really. But I'd been working, by the time they came in, I'd been working for nearly 10 years, and I'd been doing 2 things in the end. A lot of work in the Middle East. So I was greening the deserts of Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia with this contracting company. But I'd also been very much involved with inner city housing in problem areas, Deptford, Brixton, Toxteth in Liverpool, always involving local people in, and particularly with kids, in growing things as a way of engaging them with their environment and empowering them. And when the Thatcher government came in, all of that work stopped. There was no spending in public housing. But then somebody in the Department of the Environment, as it was then, I think, recognised what I'd been doing, which was basically empowering people to take more responsibility for their own patch, which is really good, kind of Tory stuff. And it wasn't costing anything. You know, all I was doing was tinkering around with a bunch of kids planting trees and that kind of thing. And I always, so they kind of recruited me into a special unit called the Priority Estates Project. And I worked for the next 4 or 5 years, I suppose, in some of the grimmest bits of inner city England. And I always say one of the great moments, really, in my working life was at the end of the Brixton riots in 1981. Everything had been trashed, burned out cars, smashed windows. Nobody had touched the sunflowers on the Tulse Hill Nature Garden because the kids had grown the sunflowers on the Tulse Hill Nature Garden, and everybody knew that. And that was really formative for me. Out of that, I was still living in the West Midlands. I got together with a few friends and we established the first urban wildlife group in Birmingham and the Black Country. It's now the Wildlife Trust there. And that was a complete revolution in nature conservation terms, really. Such opposition to it from the surrounding rural county wildlife trusts, who all
really
basically say, you wouldn't have believed it, really. This was 1981, 80.
Yeah.
Really vitriolic criticism from the chairman of the Worcestershire Wildlife Trust, the Staffordshire Wildlife Trust, the Shropshire Wildlife Trust, because they just said, you're devaluing the currency of nature conservation because you're talking about there being something of value in urban areas. And
wow.
I mean, it's difficult to believe that now, but it's true. And we had a very big project, a big challenge in Birmingham. There was a huge sand and gravel quarry with pools and ponds in the bottom of it, lots of kids on their BMX bikes riding up and down, and a lot of wildlife. And I wrote to the RSPB at the time and said, we'd really like your help to try and save this place. And they just wrote a very short letter back saying, it's in Birmingham, there can't be anything of interest to us.
Wow.
And as a consequence, we lost a colony of 200 pairs of sand martins from the cliffs in this sand quarry. So, you know, that was really spectacularly different kind of approach to conservation.
So
what we were saying was there may or may not be interesting wildlife in places like Birmingham, but sure as eggs, there are thousands and thousands of people. And actually, you know, if you're serious about conservation, you have to actually bring the wildlife to the people rather than assuming that these people can get out to somewhere in the countryside on the off chance of just seeing a kingfisher or whatever it is that the conservation movement was offering at the time. So very different times, really.
Because I think at that time there was a sense that, so we're talking now about the 80s and early 90s.
Yeah,
there was a sense,
early 80s, really.
Early 80s, yeah. So there was a sense of nature being somewhat separate from people, whereas now we understand it's important to integrate both and that nature is all around us and it's essential to appreciate that for our own well-being. So at what time did you feel that really took off, the idea of there being urban nature and having that recognised? Because it is widely understood now.
Well, I mean, you're quite right. I did a BBC Gardener's World in 1979, and I created something that I called a rich habitat garden on Gardener's World. It was a makeover, 2 programmes makeover. And the presenter was Peter Seabrook, and there was just a wonderful moment when he said, so Chris, what's the idea of this garden that you've designed? And I said, well, I want it to be a family garden, of course. It was on a housing estate in Peterborough. But I want to attract as much wildlife as possible. And Peter looked at me and said, "And you really think Britain's gardeners are going to be interested in that?" That was 79. Well, that fired me with a determination. And in 1985, I made the very first wildlife garden at Chelsea Flower Show. So that's almost 40 years ago. And again, complete revolution, really, in that I remember on the first day I arrived and you're given a corner of a football pitch to create your garden in at Chelsea. And I wanted my lawn to be full of cowslips and daisies. And of course I got a patch of grass without a single daisy in it. So my first day was spent going around all the other show garden designers, digging up their daisies and moving them to my garden. So by the end of the first day, they all knew that some nutcase had arrived at the end of the avenue and was creating something different. But it really caught the imagination. I mean, it was the kind of the poster. I was the poster boy of the RHS that year in all the papers, because it was such a contrast to everything else. But also, it was clearly really resonating with people. You know, people
Yes.
even at Chelsea, where they're there to be awestruck by the wonders of these glorious plants and things, looked at my garden and said, "Oh God, we've got daisies in our lawn. I never thought that was a positive thing."
Yeah.
So I think for me that was the changing point. And I made a television program at the same time called Blue Tits and Bumblebees. I spent a year changing my own garden into a wildlife garden, and that again. Lots of people, even now, 40 years later, still tell me that was the turning point for them, that they watched that programme. And that then led on to The Wild Side of Town, which you mentioned earlier, which was a 5-part series, which just showed people that actually the green spaces where we live and work are really important and rich and interesting and full of wildlife. So by 1980, that went out in 1987, I think, things had really begun to change. And the urban wildlife group by that time had really grown. But the Margaret Thatcher thing is interesting, I think, because when we started the Urban Wildlife Group, 1980, traditionally the conservation charities would be run by retired brigadiers on pensions and 2 or 3 people. And then in the early days of the Thatcher government, unemployment was very high, graduates couldn't get jobs, and they created something called the Manpower Services Commission, temporary employment schemes. So within about 6 months of starting the Urban Wildlife Group with these 3 or 4 friends, we had 40 staff. We had 3 qualified ecologists, we had a town planner, we had all these young, enthusiastic graduates who came and worked for the Urban Wildlife Group. And that transformed everything, really, because that began to professionalise the conservation movement. And until a few years ago, if you talk to almost anybody at the top end of the National Trust, the RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, Plant Life, any of those organisations, in their late 50s and 60s, they would all say, well, my career began with that job creation programme in the early 80s. So that was an unintended consequence of Mrs. Thatcher getting into power, which I always smile about, really. I don't think she ever intended that to happen.
Well, that's fascinating. And one of the things you spoke about earlier was the Chelsea Flower Show. And gardening at that time in the mid-80s was about being pristine. It was very, very neat. And I used to listen to BBC Essex Garden Show at that time. Mm-hmm. And I remember, I'm not going to say his name, the presenter saying, "I am appalled by the potential ban or the concerns over peat being used in gardens. What people don't understand is the harm that's been done to people's gardens by not using peat." And this is how far we've come. And of course, obviously, I love Chelsea Flower Show and try and go there as much as possible. And it's all about nature. Every single garden is referencing nature, and I'm a big fan of Gardener's World and gardening programmes, and particularly on the BBC, everything is nature first, nature first. Do you think that the tide could turn back slightly where some of these designed gardens are so naturalistic that people will fight against that and go back to some kind of control uniform garden. What are your thoughts on that?
I think Chelsea and the other garden shows are having quite an interesting impact, aren't they? Just to go back to 1985, when I did my garden, the Chelsea medal that I got is inscribed on the back of it to J.C. Baines for his wildfire garden, because the RHS just couldn't get their heads around the idea that wildlife and garden could be in the same sentence, let alone the same Chelsea medal. So we have come a hell of a long way when you look at the gardens now, and they're full of foxgloves and cowslips and primroses, and every pond is a naturalistic looking pond. I just think that actually probably the beaver habitat garden of 2 years ago, I think it was, or 3 years ago,
I remember that,
was probably a bit of a turning point, because I think that raised the kind of issue that we need to restore habitat. We need to be clever at recreating wildlife habitat, but not necessarily in gardens. And so there was a bit of a backlash at that point, and then all this kind of celebration of weeds and other stuff that comes out. But I think overall, I mean, I would say that most gardeners, most gardeners anyway, are managing to strike a balance. Most people with gardens aren't gardeners. That's important to remember that. They're people who happen to have a garden. So they're going to be influenced by the latest trend, I guess, and that will continue. But for me, what's really been important is that in the last 10 years, I suppose, there's been a realisation that whilst gardens, working with nature in gardens has made a difference to some species, to bumblebees and goldfinches and various other aspects of wildlife, it's not enough. You know, while I've been doing that for the last 40 or 50 years, we've seen this spectacular loss of wildlife in the countryside. I mean, the report that came out in the autumn last year, confirming that the UK is officially the most nature-depleted country in Europe, and that we've lost 60% of our farmland birds, we've lost 98% of our wildflower meadows. That's been happening while I've been encouraging people to feed the blue tits and their boxes up. So now I think there is a real shift in conservation to realising that two things, that they have to work to restore and recreate habitat in the wider countryside, and that to do that they have to work with other people, they have to work with farmers, they have to work with house builders, they have to work with the water industry, with the highways agencies, because we need that kind of scale of recovery. And to some extent the encouragement that's come from wildlife gardening gives some incentive to believe that we can do that. And there are good examples. If you think about driving along motorways these days, and at this time of year, just endless sheets of oxeye daisy, and before that, cowslips. Now that wouldn't have happened really, I don't think, without some real campaigning 35 years ago. So there is good news out there, but by and large, the wider countryside is a desert compared to what it was like when I was a kid. And now there is a real drive to change that.
Yeah, there are some really good initiatives. We're seeing areas of rewilding, and also, our verges are not as well maintained, thank goodness. But you spoke earlier about almost from being from the outside in organisations, and that's something I really believe in as well, that as an environmentalist, we need to be within the organisations that are affecting land use change. And the first time I met you, Chris, was at the Haygate estate in the Elephant and Castle. Gosh, probably, 10 years ago.
At least 10,
and I was quite nervous about meeting you because I was a fan, and I'm always late for everything. And I left my home and drove this tree radar, this route scanning machine that we had, and that was why I was going to be there, to meet you, to do some filming. And I was in such a flap that I packed 2 left boots, didn't I? And I turned up with 2 left riggers boots, which I had to pretend were comfortable because you were filming my feet. as I rolled this machine across. But the Haygate estate in the Elephant and Castle by Lend-Lease, I think just looks amazing now. Perhaps you can describe your role and a bit about the estate itself.
Well, I'm somebody who's always, throughout my career, I've always been a sole trader. I've always been independent, and I've always worked with industry rather than against it. So over the years, I've chaired advisory boards for the water companies. I've worked with, I ran a big national campaign around the planting of trees, the Trees of Time and Place campaign with ESSO at the turn of the century. And I also worked on the Olympics, on the London Olympics, as an advisor on the Athletes' Village particularly. And Lend-Lease were the developers of that whole Stratford East and the shopping centre and the housing there. So I'd worked with them for 4 or 5 years, and then they took up the challenge of redeveloping the Haygate estate. And the Haygate estate was notorious by then. It had been built in the 1970s, early 70s, and had been actually 2,500 or 2,000 apartments completely empty for 10 years. In fact, if you Googled the Haygate estate in 2007 or 8, what you would have seen is pictures of Michael Caine being knifed in an underpass because it was used almost entirely as a police movies and crime movies set. Nobody lived there. It was a scary place. There were a lot of drug trafficking went on in there. But it was three underground stops from Bank. I mean, there's really in the heart of London, with its own railway station on the doorstep. You know, everything about it suggested it ought to be a fantastic success. And there it was standing empty. And a number of developers had been approached by the local authority to take it on, to demolish it and rebuild it, and they'd all walked away. And Lend-Lease took it on. And I just remember having a conversation with them when they were saying, well, the first thing the local authority had said to them was, there's trees everywhere, and it was, and still is, an extraordinary place with an urban forestry canopy of 5 stories high in London Plains, all planted in the 70s, really grown brilliantly well. And the local authority apparently said to Lend-Lease, well, you're developers, you'll want to chop all these trees down before you start. We understand that. What matters is that we found somebody who'll rebuild. And being Australian developers, they said, we've come from Sydney. We know what the future climate is going to be like in London. And believe me, the only asset you've got in this development site is these trees. And they got in touch with me and said, we need some help because we're going to be demolishing 2,000 flats, building another 2,000 in their place. And there's a lot of opposition to us chopping down the trees from the local community, but every support for doing it from the local authority. And what we want to do is work out how we can keep the trees and redevelop the site. And that's where you came in, because I persuaded them that the plan they had, which took absolutely no account of the trees whatsoever, had been just drawn up by a bunch of planners and architects they'd put their T-square along the Walworth Road and set everything up at right angles to it, completely disregarded the trees, persuaded them that they needed to completely rethink that, took the developer staff out into this terrifying housing area and got them to begin to name the groups of trees within the development so that they began to personalise that landscape. And
I
it was,
really believe in that.
It was really interesting working with them. So they completely redesigned the layout, and then I persuaded them that the most important thing about these trees was the roots. It wasn't really what was above ground, it was what was below ground. And that if they got it wrong, when they started to dig their foundations and put in their service trenches, the trees would die. But that we could do something about that. So you were brought in as part of a short film I made for the developers to talk about how you could keep these trees whilst you did the redevelopment. And one of the things we were able to do was to show that they could track where the major roots were That was one of the things which you did with the ground penetrating radar. And then we also demonstrated the use of something called the air knife, which is, as you know, a very high-speed air jet that allows you to dig trenches through this kind of landscape and not damage the roots. It blows the soil away and leaves the roots intact. And that was really key, actually. Those two things were really key, because the individual that had to be persuaded about all of this was the demolition manager. And he was a pretty unreconstructed Australian engineer. Not an easy persuasion that the trees really mattered. But he was captivated by the ground penetrating radar, by the air knife technology, toys for boys kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And really got engaged with the challenge. And as a consequence, the demolition that he did was so skillful and sensitive. And then they redesigned the whole of the service trenching system to take account of where the major routes were. And one of the really interesting things that we discovered as a part of that whole process was that these trees, these London planes, were all growing in demolished previous housing estates. So there was no soil there really at all. It was crushed brick and concrete. And in the wild, planes grow in river gravels. So these trees were growing in the equivalent inner city London river gravel, but perched on London clay with leaking water mains everywhere.
Yes.
So the trees were really doing well because the leaking water mains of London were irrigating them unofficially. And that meant that if we were going to actually keep these trees, they had to do something about... They had to stop the leaking water mains because politically that was required, if you like. And so as a part of the end landscape, there's a whole rainwater catchment system that takes the rain that falls on the buildings, gathers it together and irrigates the trees. And the trees, not all of them, but a very large proportion of these very big trees survived, are growing, thriving, and the first stage of the housing development was shortlisted for the Sterling Prize, really largely because it's big tower blocks, but with the amazing 5 and 6 story high London planes.
Well, hats off also to Tree Work Environmental Practice, who were the lead arboriculturalists on that project, and the visionary and detailed work they carried out. I was a mere subcontractor for them. But part of the work they carried out with Suffolk Council was an analysis of the financial value of the trees which did have to be removed and projecting that forward. And I believe that 900 trees were planted in the vicinity of the estate, not just planting in the streets around, and they've done really well. And a few years ago, I led a Institute of Chartered Foresters walking tour of the Haygate estate and its environs with Southwark and some really key individuals there, and it was great to see how those trees are flourishing. And it was the largest new park, Elephant Park, was the largest new park in London for a really long time. So now I really, really enjoyed that. And that speaks to the power of, again, being the inside of these organisations that perhaps people who care for the environment would just immediately see as being bad folks. But actually, we have a duty to get in there and influence. And one of the things that I also notice that you do is you're doing some work with UK Power Network, and my own story of that is Noel and I moved to Suffolk from Essex just over a year ago, and very happy here. And as part of our very detailed house search, it was to avoid this pylon line. And everywhere I drive around here and down into Essex, there are stop the pylons. Now, there are many reasons why, but I'm interested from the inside as chair of the stakeholders group, what your thoughts are on the project and the pros and cons of underground cabling. I think it's called HVDC, is it? And pylons and your experience also of carefully locating pylons.
Well, it's been an interesting journey, really. The regulator, Ofgem, who determines what National Grid can actually do and what they can spend money on. And everything that National Grid does is funded by electricity bill players, you and me, and the regulator kind of stands between those two groups. And 12 years ago, there was a campaign by CPR, a Campaign for Protection of Rural England, to try and reduce the visual impact of pylons in national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty. And they persuaded the regulator that this is what should happen. They did a willingness to pay exercise, which suggested that the British bill-paying public were prepared to pay between them 1.2 billion to reduce the visual impact. So the regulator said to National Grid, OK, you can spend, at that stage, £500 million doing this work, but you can't decide where or how. You have to have an independent advisory group to work with. And they appointed me to chair that. So I've been working with National Grid for 11 years with an advisory group of about 15 or 16 senior executives from organisations like the RSPB, the National Trust, the Ramblers Association, but also government agencies like Natural England, and in Wales, the Natural Resources Wales, Historic England. So a really high-powered group of people. And that's been really important because we've been, therefore, engaging with very senior people in National Grid. So we're kind of dealing with the engine drivers, really. And all of that's been going very well, and we've removed a line of pylons from the Dorset Downs. We've removed a group of pylons from the Peak District. There's a very big project in Snowdonia, in Eryri, where we're taking the pylons out and putting the cable under the estuary in Snowdonia. So huge projects which are transforming those landscapes. All of which has been great, and everybody welcomes you into the room when you say you've come to remove their pylons. But now there is a huge shift happening because the government has signed up to all kinds of carbon net zero protocols. There is a commitment to shift from gas and coal to wind power in particular and to hydropower, so renewable energy. And the National Grid isn't fit for purpose anymore. It was built mostly 60, 70 years ago. So all of that new source of energy is coming from offshore or from the north of Scotland or from Scandinavia. And the old source of power, the coal and the gas, was all generally being produced in the middle of England, in the power stations, the cooling towers that everybody's familiar with. So there has to be a big shift of emphasis. That's one of the main things that's happening. And the other is that the prediction is that we'll be using at least twice as much electricity in our lives in 20 to 30 years' time as we are now, because with no gas boilers, with electric cars, with a whole range of other things, the demand for electricity is going to increase as well. And that's going to apply everywhere. In rural Suffolk, in rural Essex, as well as in the middle of Birmingham and London, there is going to be this huge increase in demand. So the task is, how do you connect in the new sources of energy and then distribute it effectively? And what I've learned over the last 11 years is that, of course, you can put cables underground. It's very, very much more expensive. It's very disruptive in the short term. When we removed the pylons from the Dorset Downs, my heart sank really, because we had to dig, or National Grid had to dig, a 60-metre wide trench through a whole area of that AONB, because the cables have to be separated underground. So a 60-metre wide trench.
60
all
metres?
Filled in again. It's healed now. But that was through one of the archaeologically most significant landscapes in England.
Yes.
So my role was very much to say, from day one, you have to talk to the archaeologists, you have to involve them. And the outcome of that has been the discovery of about 7 or 8 huge new archaeological sites that they didn't know existed, and a really creative relationship between National Grid and the archaeologists, with the archaeologists running international webinars on how brilliantly this relationship has worked. So that's the legacy, if you like, that we're
That's
now
interesting.
tackling. And you happen to live in an area where there's a proposal for a new line linking Norwich down to Tilbury. There's also a line bringing hydropower from northern Scotland down into Yorkshire, which will then link into the grid. And there's a need to strengthen the grid between Suffolk and Kent with the seabed connector as well. So these are huge civil engineering projects, all having to be delivered quite quickly, well, very quickly really, and all unpopular with anybody who happens to be living very close to them. And so trying to strike the balance between the collective benefit of having renewable energy, the short-term disruption of trenching and the higher cost compared with the permanence of pylons, and then actually beginning to see how we can deliver a whole range of collateral benefits in the process is really what I'm in the thick of. I had a whole day yesterday with about 30 stakeholders in Wales, just looking at the Wales situation, where there's a lot of offshore renewable energy, a lot of experimentation in wave power and a whole range of other things going on in Wales, and a need to connect in parts of Wales that are relatively underserved at the moment. And I suppose my big contribution to all of this has been to persuade National Grid that they also need to think about the natural grid. And if you think about how much the Suffolk landscape has lost in terms of wildlife and the Essex and the Norfolk landscape, we now know, and it's kind of official since the State of Nature report of last autumn, that there's been this catastrophic decline. So when I was growing up, if I'd walked through fields in Suffolk, I would have seen clouds of lapwings flying up. Now, if you're lucky, you might see one or two. And we know what the figures are. 78% decline in flying insects in that time. Yeah. 78%. No wonder there are no swallows or swifts or bats. 98% of the wildflower meadows have gone. And so I've just felt if we're going to have this massive national investment in landscape, basically in interventions across the land and the sea, this might just be the moment to bring together all of the different stakeholders to say, well, then if we're going to intervene at that scale, surely this should be the mechanism that starts to restore and rebuild and regenerate, bring back the habitats. And let's begin along those corridors that are going to be energy delivery corridors, but could also be the places where the barn owls return, the places where the skylarks start to nest again. And to do that, you have to work with the farming community. You have to get them engaged. But you also have to bring in the wisdom of the RSPB and the Wildlife Trust and all the other players. And nobody's pretending it's easy or comfortable, but it's the most exciting possibility, I think, of reversing what I've seen in my lifetime, which is just catastrophic loss. And I just think there is a national kind of level of engagement here, which needs to really resonate with the people who are going to have a line of pylons in their landscape, that this is a part of a contribution to the whole of the nation. And frankly, a line of pylons, if it leads to the restoring of a real quality of landscape and a different kind of food production that is more sustainable, and that just seems to me to be worth fighting for.
Wow. I'd never heard it explained like that before. So what we're essentially creating from Norwich down to Tilbury is a wide highway for nature. And looking at the map...
That's the ambition. And I think the really interesting thing is how engaged National Grid are with that, and how they recognise that they buy into the idea they don't know how to do it, and therefore they have to do it with the farmers, with the conservation organisations, and collectively everybody has to then persuade the regulator that this is a legitimate way to spend bill payers' money, not just to deliver the electricity, but also to deliver the songbirds.
So this podcast is not going to discuss any other issues to do with like human health and pylons. It's beyond our remit. But going back to nature, is this also, Chris, an opportunity for academic studies on changing that land use and creating, say, agroforestry? This is an opportunity to trial some different methods of landscape restoration for nature, which could then be studied and then replicated, even not underneath pylons. Is there any research that's going to be done through this
there's
large
a huge
project?
amount, and it's very dispersed. Yeah, I mean, I think we do need to do more learning, but actually there have been people pioneering this kind of land use for a long time. One of the groups that I've introduced to the National Grid is a group called the Pasture Fed Livestock Association, or Pasture for Life they're called. And these are real farmers, if you like, that are farming in ways which reduce their chemical inputs, really focus on soil quality and animal welfare and nature conservation. And I had a really interesting meeting between a group of the senior engineers and about half a dozen of these regenerative farmers from Pasture for Life. They were all women, the farmers. And there was just a very memorable moment for me. There was one of the farmers who farms in, I think, I'm not sure whether it's Norfolk or Lincolnshire, but she had been an intensive pig farmer until 6 years ago. And you might remember that as a consequence of Brexit, there were no butchers and the abattoirs couldn't cope with the pigs. So thousands of pigs were slaughtered and sent to landfill, not into the food chain.
It's terrible.
Because there was no processing available. She went out of business in pig farming, reinvented the farm, and really engaged with the Pasture for Life and with regenerative farming. And normally, I suppose, the prejudiced view is, well, this will be a hobby farmer who's, just got more money than sense or whatever, or is into wildflowers. This woman then stopped the meeting in a way by saying, and our turnover now is 2 million a year.
Yeah.
And she said, so that was a kind of showstopper.
Yeah.
And then she said, and for me, the most striking thing is that the sound of the farm is so different. She said 6 years ago, if I opened my bedroom window, I heard squealing, stressed pigs. Now I hear songbirds.
Yeah.
So the farm has just come back to life in that time. Now, if we can get those farmers engaging with their neighbours, which is what they're very much doing, and building bigger and bigger clusters of like-minded farmers, and we can then tie in the research, actually get people objectively monitoring, not just there's more birdsong, but how many more species, how many different territories, you can very quickly begin to build a different sort of picture. And there's some really interesting new technology that I've been looking at where you can have remote microphones set out on the farm being monitored. There's a guy down in Somerset who is monitoring farms around the country, and he can then produce through the software detailed minute by minute reference to exactly what birds there are, when the first of the swallows arrives, when the last of the cuckoos leaves, all of that detail. And we need that kind of information, I think, to begin to make that whole approach believable. But the critical thing for me is that it has to be done in the context of food production, not in the context of just abandonment and neglect or just conservation organisations doing it. It has to be an integral part of the way we farm in the future. And the farmers that are working in that kind of way all basically report the same thing, that their costs have gone down, their profitability has gone up, and their soil improves year after year after year.
Yes.
After generations of their soil deteriorating year after year after year.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things I want to pick out from that conversation is the power of data and sound recording. And I listened to a Radio 4 documentary about a gentleman who'd been recording birdsong since the 70s and is carrying on now, and he's sadly terminally ill and someone else is taking it over. But just by going back to the same spots and the differences in bird sound. And I'm reminded also of a recent episode with Nadina Galley, who has coined the phrase the Internet of Nature in her brilliant new book, where all of these types of data collection and using IT is really giving us that database to inform change, but it's got to be in harmony with sustainable agriculture. Now, Chris, I was chatting to a dear friend of mine, Luke Fay, and I said, I'm speaking to Chris later, what would you like to ask him? So he says hi, and he says, what is your approach to getting developers and others to recognise the benefits of retaining nature? For instance, getting Lend-Lease to see the benefit of a landscape with a 40-year head start, which you've spoken about a little bit already, and defined by its mature trees. And what did you learn from the project? Well, you have spoken about the Australian engineer and just sort of, I didn't realise we impressed him so much. But fundamentally, what did you learn from working on the Haygate project?
Well, two things spring to mind. One was that there was a very active local campaigning group. And they were, as they always are, absolutely extreme. You know, I grew up in Sheffield, and I watched in Sheffield the campaign there, and people chaining themselves to trees and generally, you know, fighting for them. And I've been involved with those things over the years. Memorably, in Windsor Great Park, managed to stop the Duke of Edinburgh chopping down a whole avenue of ancient trees there. But it wasn't me who did it. It was the campaigners coming in, camping in the trees for 3 months, which means that somebody like me can step in and say, well, that extreme point of view needs moderating, talk to me. And so the Haygate was a good example of that. The developers were having to deal, and the local authority, having to deal with really, really aggressive, I suppose, campaigning to save the trees. And I think it was significant that when I was appointed by Lend-Lease, the campaigners were happy to talk to me because they knew what I'd been doing. So I became a kind of middleman in that conversation. And then we got them involved in some of the tree survey work and the follow through. So I mean that was one of the really key things. But the other is much more kind of human nature, really. When I was first called into the developers' offices, I said, well, can I just make a 15-minute presentation about why the trees matter? Okay, they said, it's a big open plan office, so they found the space, and 20 of the designers and other people came to this session. But significantly, the big boss of the whole project had to introduce me, you know, as a guest in the offices, so he was brought in to just say, this is Chris Baines, is going to tell you about trees. But significantly, he stayed for the 15 minutes. And I could see in the group that people were looking at one another and thinking, God, he's still here. You know, this never happens. So he stayed for my 15 minutes of rant about how trees matter and stuff. And I thought no more about it until the next day I went into the same offices for a second meeting, and he sought me out. And he got his phone out of his pocket, and he said, after I'd left the office yesterday, he said, I went back home and I looked at my street and I looked at the one next door, the parallel street, and here are 2 photographs. And he said, this is the one I live in, it's full of trees, and the one we chose not to live in is 100 yards away and has no trees. And he said, now I understand that this is of commercial significance to us. People will pay more for a street with trees in it. Now, that's one person with one experience of the trees in his life. And I think we just forget that, you know, that you're dealing with guys who are running big businesses or local authorities or government ministers, but they do all have lives, and they do all have grandchildren that actually rather like watching the squirrels, and, you know, if you can engage at that kind of personal level, then I think that just makes an enormous difference.
So, listeners, I have already spoken about this, forgive me, but I went into a board meeting of a large developer recently who I've worked for a long time, and I felt could do with a chat. And it was great. And it actually gave me an hour and 15 minutes. And we had a fantastic conversation, understanding each other. And it has actually made a difference thus far with them, and I'm really delighted to be working with them. But sometimes we need to push ourselves as a horticulturalist or whatever profession you are listening to this, to actually go and speak to the people who are affecting change. You know, just try and also listen as well. So I'm jolly glad I did that. But I have another question for you.
I was at a meeting a few weeks ago, and somebody just said something really profound, I thought. They were talking about stakeholder management, and this person said, "Who do you need in your stakeholder meeting?" And there was a silence. He said, "You need all the people who are going to support you, but you also need all the people who can stop it happening."
Yes.
Because unless they're all in the room, you just don't make any progress. It's such an important point, really.
Chris, I could talk about that a lot. Like, everybody should be there and part of the discussion. I know this from personal experience. And that's something that we all need to work to change. More power of listening and deep conversation, uncomfortable conversations about thorny issues, because today it is Wednesday the 17th of July 2024. We have a new government, a Labour government in the UK, and there has been the King's speech, and one of the things that the Labour Party is saying is we are going to get back to building in Britain. We've heard it from many different politicians before. I'm not making any political comment at all here. We don't on this podcast. We can expect 1.5 million new homes built by private practice and private developers, including on the grey belt. So my thoughts are it's never more important to speak to everybody about that. But what are your sort of threats and opportunities, really, to do with this new house building drive, and what can we as environmentalists do to help?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, the core issue is having better conversations, I think, and not being seduced just by the numbers, because I think that's been part of the problem all along, really. And I think really the good developers. I've worked with housing developers a lot over my life, and the really inspiring ones are the ones that begin by thinking about the place they want to build, and then think about how you put the accommodation into that place. I said in the 1990s, I used to be called in by the House Builders Federation as the kind of light entertainment after their conference lunch, let's bait an environmentalist for 20 minutes. And they always used to then, at the bar afterwards, say, we're not nearly as bad as everybody says as an industry. And I eventually said, look, I believe you, but absolutely nobody else does. You're house builders, you destroy places. Why don't we set up an award scheme to seek out the best and celebrate it? So we set up something called the Greenleaf Housing Awards, which I then chaired for about 15 years. And there were all kinds of interesting things. I managed to get lots of awards within it, sponsored by different organisations, and the great moment was every year when the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust presented the best housing wetland scheme, and the award was a double life-sized great-crested newt, bronze great-crested newt, which the house builders kind of winced at when they won that. But I just remember that some of the best housing was retirement housing. There was a fantastic, relatively small developer building in market towns across the south of England, in really very sensitive places. But their philosophy was, we accumulate the land beginning with somewhere that nobody wants, like a derelict petrol station or something. So everybody says, well, that would be great if that gets changed. We then accumulate enough land to make it viable. But then we sit down and say, what kind of gardens could we create for this retirement house, home? And once we've kind of got that in our heads, we then think about how we can fit the housing into that landscape. And I was so impressed by the way that they worked. I went there and made I used to present a gardening programme in the south of England. We went and filmed there. And then about 20 years later, I went back, something I'd never normally do, but I went back, and there it all was, looking like a National Trust garden with all this housing. So I went in and took some photographs, and the gardener was there hoeing away in one corner, and he came across eventually, because obviously what on earth I was doing. And I explained that I'd been there 20 years earlier to film it. And he said, oh, come round the corner, there's somebody you might like to meet. And round the corner was his truck, and in the cab was his dad. And his dad had been the gardener 20 years earlier that had been looking after this landscape.
Oh.
Now, I mean, it was
That's
great
rare.
moment.
That really speaks to how appreciated that landscape is. That's really great.
Well, and then I contacted the developers and I said, I'm so impressed by the way it looks. Who lives there now? Because I'd interviewed lots of the residents 20 years earlier. They'd had a barbecue and he said, well, actually, to be honest, they're nearly all the same people. They've lived there for 20 years. They've had a kind of third phase of their lives. And now the only real difference is that lots of nurses and carers come in every morning, whereas 20 years earlier they were having barbecues and joining together. So I suppose the answer is that developers have to be persuaded to think about place and neighbourhood and community and how the new housing enhances that and fits in with it. And that's not what's been happening generally in house building, I don't.
So I have another question for you from Nev Fay. Chris, you started NUFU all those years ago and was right, prescient and ahead of the times. How well has our progression as society advanced to meet your ambitions to those original goals?
National Urban Forestry Unit is what NUFU stands for, and it really wasn't me that ran that. It was Neris, my partner, and it really grew out of the whole urban wildlife movement, I guess, and in beginning to realise that green spaces in towns were important for people and nature and all the rest of it. I think that the movement generally has grown enormously, and there is a real value now placed on the green space. And the kinds of things that have changed in that time are a realisation that this is as much to do with human health as it is to do with nature conservation, that it's as much to do with stormwater management and air quality and overheating of cities as it is to do with a nice place to live, And interestingly, just today, there was yet another report on the prospects for urban Britain as climate change really kind of progresses. More and more elderly people at risk because of overheating in the summer, serious localised stormwater flooding with the rainstorms getting more extreme. And there is now, I think, a really clear connection in policymakers' minds, in developers' minds, in environmentalist minds, between the continuous canopy of urban forests and a response to those environmental factors. Having said that, I think there is still an absolute political preoccupation with planting new trees and almost no real support for hanging on to the existing mature urban forest. I mean, I'm in the middle of Wolverhampton. I'm looking out of my window at trees that were planted by the Victorians, and they are fundamentally affecting the quality of my life and the quality of the environment here. And they go one by one for the most ridiculous of reasons. We lost 3 really, really beautiful planes just up the road 2 or 3 years ago now, because the Highways Agency had slightly changed the camber of the road in resurfacing it. The double-decker buses, therefore, all leaned slightly more than they did before, and they hit the trees, so the trees had to come down. And planting another 3 or even another 30 trees to replace those 3 in my lifetime and your lifetime is not going to make the difference in terms of environmental quality, in terms of shade, in terms of shelter, in terms of stormwater runoff. So there needs to be hugely more effort, I think, to manage and maintain the legacy of mature trees in our urban areas. Of course we need to plant new ones, but actually it's hanging on to the existing tree canopy that is absolutely crucial, which is why I, and I suspect you and Luke and Neville and all these other people are so proud of the Haygate, because
Yes.
that could have been another place that lost all its big trees. And I would encourage anybody to just go there. Go there on the hottest summer day that we have.
Yes.
And then you realise how valuable 5-storey high London plane trees can be in that urban environment.
Chris, it's been an absolute joy to speak to you. One of the things that really strikes me is you've always been ahead of your time. You've always been very visionary and have been a really strong, consistent voice for nature. And I bet it hasn't been easy. And you've chosen to go into the difficult spaces where people are not naturally receptive to environmental matters. And you've made it your business and your mission to go in there and effect change. And in doing so, you are making a tangible difference to our landscapes. But you've also made a tangible difference to people's lives, my own included, as strutting about in a local authority, all shoulder pads and false nails and high heels, being inspired by your book, storming into the Parks Department and bossily telling them to stop mowing as much. Professor Chris Baines, it's been an absolute honour to interview you and to have known you so long. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon.
Everybody has superpowers, every single person in the world. And I think mine is idea generation. Idea spaghetti coming. You've been with me sometimes, and it's like idea spaghetti, you know, like Play-Doh. Like when I was a kid, I loved Play-Doh. My kids had Play-Doh. I used to make their own Play-Doh. And then I had something called a barbershop, or I've seen these barbershop Play-Dohs. And you push the Play-Doh in this looks like a minion or something, and you squeeze it up, and it all comes out like hair.